Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Owen McCoy inherited 400 acres of wild Colorado land, he didn't expect war. But when a ruthless HOA queen set her sights on his forest, his quiet world ignited. What began as a simple trail project turned into a battle for legacy, land, and the soul of independence. When my grandfather passed away, he left behind something far greater than money or heirlooms. He left me a legacy. 400 acres of pristine land tucked away in the rolling hills of Colorado, open pastures kissed by the sun, a cold, winding creek that never dried, and, most impressive of all, an ancient forest so dense and untouched it felt like stepping into another century. To me, this land wasn't just dirt and trees. It was a living memory of my family's endurance, stubbornness, and quiet pride. My name's Owen McCoy, and if there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I value independence more than anything else. Always have. That's why inheriting this land felt less like a gift and more like a calling. I wasn't about to let anything or anyone meddle with what had been in my bloodline for over 130 years. But times had changed around here, and not necessarily for the better. The city had stretched its arms, grasping for every wild corner it could tame. Not 2 miles from my western fence line, a sprawling luxury development called Aspen Ridge had mushroomed up, cookie-cutter mansions with identical driveways, obsessively manicured lawns, and a homeowners association so powerful they practically considered themselves a government. Aspen Ridge HOA was a different beast altogether, polished, ruthless, and led by a woman named Jennifer Miller. If the rumors were to be believed, Jennifer treated Aspen Ridge like her personal kingdom, complete with fines for unapproved Christmas lights and threats over uncoordinated mailbox colors. I didn't pay them much mind at first. After all, my land was officially recorded as private property, outside of any HOA jurisdiction. I wasn't bound by their rules, fees, or petty standards. My deeds, surveys, and county records were crystal clear. I was an island unto myself, answerable to no one. Still, it didn't escape me how close the edge of their perfect world had crept toward my rugged one. Driving past their ornate gates and fake stone signs made me uneasy. I had no illusions about the kind of people who lived behind those gates. People who saw open land not as something to be respected, but as something that should be curated, controlled, beautified to death. I stayed polite whenever I crossed paths with Aspen Ridge residents at the feed store or town meetings. We existed in separate worlds, and I intended to keep it that way. But sometimes, when the wind was just right, I could hear their weekend parties echo across the creek, their laughter brushing against my trees like an early warning. Their world was expanding, and mine, it seemed, was in their way. At night, sitting on the porch of the old farmhouse with a cup of coffee in hand, I would watch the stars blanketed across the sky. Stars that the people of Aspen Ridge probably never even noticed behind their designer lighting and security cameras. I felt safe then, cocooned by my woods, stubborn as the oaks that surrounded me. The trees had stood for centuries against storms and droughts, against change and greed, and so would I. I thought naively that so long as I minded my own business, they would mind theirs. But as I would soon learn, to people like Jennifer Miller, someone else's independence wasn't just a curiosity, it was a threat. And threats in their world had to be eliminated. It started as simply as any ordinary weekend project. Early that Saturday morning, I laced up my boots, grabbed my work gloves, and headed down to the south end of the property, the part of the forest that dipped near the old dry creek bed. I had a vision for this spot. A winding walking trail through the woods, a clearing with a stone fire pit where family and friends could gather on crisp autumn nights. Nothing big, nothing commercial, just a small space carved respectfully out of the wild for those who appreciated it. I hired a local crew to help clear some of the underbrush and a few scraggly trees that had been dying for years. We marked only what absolutely needed to go, no more, no less. The chainsaws buzzed through the cool morning air, their sound blending into the symphony of birdsong and wind in the branches. I supervised closely, making sure we disturbed as little as possible. It was my land, after all, my responsibility to steward it right. The work had barely stretched into its third day when the first sign of trouble appeared. As I was checking the equipment near the trailhead, a white SUV rolled to a stop by my fence line. Out stepped a man in a crisp polo shirt holding a clipboard. He didn't approach, didn't wave. Just stood there, scribbling something furiously while glancing up at my workers. His SUV bore the distinct emblem of Aspen Ridge HOA on the door. I narrowed my eyes but said nothing. A few hours later, while I was stacking cut wood, I spotted a different car slowing down, this one with a woman snapping photos from the passenger seat. Same HOA emblem on the dashboard. The next morning, the letter arrived. Delivered by courier, no less, like it was some grand proclamation. I slid it open with my pocket knife and scanned the contents. Notice of violation. You have committed unauthorized destruction of environmentally protected woodland within the Aspen Ridge Community Buffer Zone. Immediate cessation of activity is demanded. Penalty for violation, $50,000. I read the letter twice, my pulse thudding heavier with each line. I had to laugh, an ugly, hollow sound that echoed across my empty yard. My land. Part of Aspen Ridge. Since when? Since never. I wasn't under their authority. I wasn't even near their so-called buffer zone, a term that seemed made up on the spot. What stunned me more than the ridiculous fine was the audacity. These people had looked at my trees that had stood for generations on my soil, and decided they had the right to govern them, as if my family's land was just an extension of their manicured kingdom. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't just about trees. This was about control. I spent the rest of the evening gathering every deed, survey, and property map I owned. I pulled dusty files from my grandfather's safe, official stamps, boundary markers, old aerial photos from before Aspen Ridge was even a blueprint on some architect's table. I stacked the documents neatly on the kitchen table, each piece a weapon in the battle I knew was coming. Because if there's one thing I've learned about people like Jennifer Miller, it's that they don't send letters like this for no reason. No, this was just their opening move. 2 mornings after I received that absurd notice, I was out by the clearing again, going over some final plans with the crew, when I heard the sharp crunch of tires on gravel. I turned toward the noise and immediately recognized the gleaming white convoy coming up my drive. 2 SUVs, spotless, adorned with Aspen Ridge HOA decals, crawling toward me like sharks scenting blood. At the front of the procession stood a woman I didn't need an introduction to, Jennifer Miller herself. Mid-40s, polished within an inch of her life, with a clipboard clutched so tightly in her hand, it looked like she intended to use it as a weapon. She stepped out of the SUV with 2 men in dark security uniforms flanking her like she was royalty. No greeting, no attempt at politeness. She stormed toward me, heels clicking aggressively against the dirt, like she expected the ground itself to part for her. "You there," she barked, as if addressing a misbehaving servant. "Cease operations immediately. You are in gross violation of the Aspen Ridge HOA environmental standards." I leaned casually against a post, arms crossed. "Ma'am," I said, forcing a calm I didn't quite feel, "this is private property. You have no authority here." She waved a manicured hand as if brushing away an annoying fly. "Private property or not, your actions impact the greater community. This land falls within the designated environmental buffer of Aspen Ridge. You are destroying a protected ecosystem." Her voice was sharp, practiced, meant to intimidate. The so-called security guards behind her stepped forward, arms folded, making a show of their presence. I said nothing. Instead, I calmly walked to my truck, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out the folder I had prepared. Without a word, I handed Jennifer the top documents: my grandfather's original deed, the county's property line surveys, and a certified letter from the recorder's office confirming that my land had never been part of any HOA or municipal preservation project. Jennifer took the papers with a dramatic sigh, skimming them far too quickly to actually read. Her face flickered for just a second, barely perceptible, but I caught it. Confusion, then irritation, then stubborn resolve. "This doesn't change the fact," she snapped, thrusting the folder back at me, "that your actions are disruptive to the character of our community." "Our community," I said, my voice low. "Lady, this land was here before your community had a name." Her cheeks flushed a dangerous shade of red. "If you refuse to comply voluntarily, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter through legal channels. Fines, property liens, lawsuits. You are leaving me no choice." "Do what you have to do," I said simply, stuffing the folder back into my truck. "And while you're at it, make sure your boys over there don't step so much as a boot across my fence line. I'd hate to have to add trespassing charges to the mix." The guards shifted uncomfortably. Jennifer squared her shoulders, trying to hold on to the tatters of her authority. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You'll regret this," she hissed. With that, she turned sharply on her heel, her little entourage scrambling to follow. I watched them retreat, dust kicking up behind their tires as they sped down my driveway. I stood there for a long moment after they were gone, the warm wind rustling the trees around me. I had no idea what kind of storm was about to roll in, but for the first time, I realized it wouldn't be enough just to defend my rights. I was going to have to fight for them. The morning after Jennifer's little invasion, I sat at my kitchen table, the old wood worn smooth by decades of use, flipping through the paperwork with a steaming cup of coffee at my elbow. I had no doubt she wasn't done with me. Not by a long shot. If there's one thing people like her can't tolerate, it's being told no. I decided it was time to stop playing defense. I called my attorney, Mark Jeffries, a man with a sharp mind and even sharper instincts when it came to property law. By noon, he was at my place. Documents spread across the table, a frown etched deep into his forehead. "This whole claim about a community buffer zone is complete nonsense," he said, tapping the survey map. "Your property lines are clear, but something about this feels off." Mark had a nose for trouble. He suggested we commission a fresh satellite analysis and a detailed title search, not just on my land, but on the lots abutting my property, especially the ones closest to the old creek. It took 3 days. 3 long days of waiting, walking my land, and feeling the weight of history pressing on my shoulders. The woods felt different now, less like a sanctuary, more like a battlefield in waiting. On the evening of the 3rd day, Mark called me. His voice was practically vibrating with restrained excitement. "You're going to want to see this," he said. I met him at his office the next morning. Laid out on his desk were high-resolution satellite images, property line overlays, and decades-old permitting documents. He pointed to a small structure deep inside the tree line, almost invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. "That," he said, tapping the paper, "is a building, and according to these surveys, it sits entirely on your land." My stomach dropped. We cross-referenced the HOA development permits. Aspen Ridge had strict building regulations, of course. Every square foot accounted for, every garden gnome practically needing a committee vote. Yet nowhere was this structure documented. Mark flipped to another set of photos. A cozy little summer house, tucked into the woods like a smug secret. Matching it against community newsletters and Jennifer's public posts, it became sickeningly clear. The house was hers. Jennifer Miller, queen of Aspen Ridge, paragon of rules and regulations, had built a private getaway cabin outside her own property lines, without permission, without permits, and worse, she had done it on my land. My shock hardened quickly into fury. It wasn't just the hypocrisy, though that was bitter enough. It was the arrogance. She hadn't just tried to find me. She hadn't just tried to control me. She had stolen from me. Mark leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You have grounds to sue for unlawful occupation, trespass, damages to your natural land, and punitive costs. If we file a formal complaint, it will force disclosure of how long she's known." I nodded slowly, feeling the familiar, grounding anger rise inside me. "Do it," I said. "File everything." Mark gave a sharp, satisfied smile. "And Owen, based on what I'm seeing, you won't just win. You'll bury her." As I drove home that afternoon, the late summer sun filtering through the trees, I looked out over my land. The ancient oaks, the thick tangles of brush, the roots that ran deeper than any HOA's reach. They had survived fire and drought, war and time, and now, together, we would survive this. The courthouse was a brutal slab of gray concrete that looked as cold and unwelcoming as the process unfolding inside it. I sat at the plaintiff's table, calm on the outside, but every nerve beneath my skin was strung tight. Across the aisle sat Jennifer Miller, dressed to the nines in a tailored navy suit, flanked by her expensive legal team. She didn't look at me, not once. Her eyes stayed glued to the stack of papers in front of her, like ignoring me could somehow erase what was coming. Mark handled most of the talking. Cool, clinical, devastating. He laid it all out in a precise, ruthless timeline. The historic property boundaries confirmed by government surveys, the unauthorized construction of Jennifer's summer home on my land, the environmental damage caused during its building, the repeated attempts by the HOA to assert false authority over property that had never fallen under their jurisdiction. When the judge asked Jennifer's attorneys to respond, they stumbled. They tried to argue that the encroachment had been a good faith mistake, that property lines in the forest were easily confused. But Mark had already anticipated that. He presented photos of survey markers, clearly visible, undisturbed, and older than Aspen Ridge itself. There was no confusion. There was only arrogance. Then came the aerial photographs, the satellite images side by side with the HOA's own promotional materials. Jennifer had proudly featured her little hideaway into marketing campaigns, boasting about private retreats within walking distance of home. She knew. She had known all along. As the evidence piled up, Jennifer's polished facade began to crack. I caught the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her water glass. Her lawyers whispered furiously into her ear, but the tide had turned. There was no salvaging this. When it was my turn to testify, I stood and spoke simply. I told the court about my family's history on that land. I explained how the trees Jennifer had so casually trampled were older than the very concept of Aspen Ridge. I described the importance of stewardship, of respecting land that wasn't just acreage on a map, but a living, breathing heritage. Jennifer's lawyers tried a few feeble objections, but by then it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. The judge didn't take long to deliver his verdict. He ruled in my favor on every count. Unlawful occupation, environmental damage, trespass, and punitive damages. Jennifer Miller was ordered to demolish her cabin at her own expense. She was ordered to pay me $450,000 in compensation for the destruction of natural habitat and the stress her harassment had caused, but it didn't end there. The judge also slapped Aspen Ridge HOA with a hefty fine for their complicity, $600,000 for attempting to enforce false claims over land they had no legal standing to touch. They were found guilty of harassment and abuse of authority, and the court ordered a formal investigation into their practices. Jennifer sat frozen as the words fell like hammer blows. Her lawyers gathered their papers in silence, their faces grim. As I left the courtroom that day, the late afternoon sun was glaring off the courthouse steps. I took a deep breath of warm, clean air. My boots scuffed the concrete as I made my way down to the parking lot, each step lighter than the last. For the first time in weeks, I felt it. Peace. But deep down, I knew peace was something Jennifer Miller would never accept. And sure enough, she wasn't finished yet. I should have known that people like Jennifer don't go down quietly. For a while after the verdict, it seemed like the storm had finally passed. The demolition crew tore down her illegal cabin in less than a week, and Aspen Ridge HOA sent out carefully worded letters to their residents assuring them of internal reviews and policy updates. It was all PR fluff. Meanwhile, I focused on reclaiming my land, planting young saplings where the soil had been torn up, clearing the rubble and scars left behind. But the peace didn't last long. It started with small things. One morning, I found my old woodshed door hanging off its hinges, the lock smashed clean through. Nothing stolen, just ruined. A few days later, tire tracks snaked deep into my back pasture where no car had any business being. And then came the brush fire, small, easily contained thanks to the quick response of the local volunteer fire department, but dangerously close to my drying hay bales. At first, I thought it might have been some teenagers being stupid, maybe a hunter who got careless with a cigarette. I wanted to believe that. But in my gut, I knew better. I checked the security footage I'd installed months earlier, the cameras hidden at strategic points around the property. And there she was. Grainy but unmistakable. Jennifer Miller herself stepping out of a dark SUV late one night, lighter fluid in hand, splashing it along the base of my woodshed. It was clumsy, desperate. A woman cornered and lashing out. I didn't hesitate. I packaged the footage and drove straight to the sheriff's office. The deputies recognized Jennifer immediately. This wasn't her first brush with the law, though never for anything this serious. They took the evidence without question and assured me they'd act quickly. 2 nights later, I heard the crunch of gravel and the flash of red and blue lights out front. From my porch, coffee cup in hand, I watched as Jennifer was led away in handcuffs, her expression a twisted snarl of rage and disbelief. She barked at the deputies, claiming innocence, claiming harassment, even claiming she was protecting the community from ecological destruction. The irony nearly made me laugh. The charges were serious. Attempted arson, criminal trespass, filing false reports with state environmental agencies, and attempted extortion. Her bail was set high, given the severity of the offenses and the fact that she was now a demonstrated danger to the public. But the fallout didn't end with Jennifer. Aspen Ridge HOA, already staggering under court sanctions, found itself embroiled in further scandal. Investigations revealed how deep the corruption ran, how Jennifer had used HOA funds for personal projects, intimidated dissenting board members, and falsified community records. More lawsuits followed, more resignations. Within weeks, Aspen Ridge, a symbol of manufactured perfection, started to crumble under the weight of its own lies. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated. In a way, I suppose I did. But mostly, I felt exhausted. Worn down by the sheer absurdity of it all. I hadn't asked for this war. All I wanted was to live in peace, among the trees that had been my family's silent witnesses for over a century. Still, as I sat on my porch that night, the stars winking into existence above the treetops, I knew something had shifted for good. Jennifer Miller would never set foot on my land again. Aspen Ridge would think twice before coming after their neighbors. And my woods, scarred, battered, but still standing, would heal. Just like I would. The first thing I did once the dust settled was rebuild the old woodshed. It wasn't about the structure itself. It was about restoring something Jennifer had tried to tear down. Piece by piece, I replaced the broken boards, hammered in fresh nails, and watched as something battered became whole again. It felt right. Like reclaiming a part of myself. The land needed healing too. In the autumn, I hired a small crew to help replant the areas where Jennifer's cabin had once stood. We laid down native grass seed, planted young pines and aspens, and cleared the debris until the forest floor could breathe again. I spent long hours walking the trails, checking the saplings, whispering promises into the soil. You'll grow strong again. We all will. Word about what had happened spread through the surrounding communities. At first, it was whispers, scandalized tones about Aspen Ridge's golden president being arrested, but soon it turned into something else. People started stopping by the farm stand at the edge of my property, sometimes just to shake my hand, sometimes just to say thank you. It surprised me how many of them had stories of their own. Neighbors from a mile out, people I barely knew, told me about fines for mailbox colors, harassment over yard signs, threats for leaving up Christmas lights too long. Jennifer's HOA hadn't just gone after me, they had bullied anyone they thought they could control, and no one had stood up to them until now. I didn't set out to be a symbol, but somehow that's what I became. I decided it was time to make a statement of my own. At the main entrance to my property, I installed a large wooden sign carved by hand from an oak that had fallen naturally during a storm the year before. In bold letters it read, McCoy Woods, established 1887. Private land, no HOA, no unauthorized construction. The trees here are older than your rules. Simple, unapologetic. Just like my grandfather would have wanted. Aspen Ridge HOA, now under new leadership, reached out to me quietly through their attorneys, trying to smooth things over. They offered a formal apology and a modest settlement to avoid any future litigation. I didn't need their money, but I made sure they put it in writing. They would never again attempt to impose any rules, fines, or restrictions on my property. The land remained mine, free and sovereign. Sometimes, when the wind shifts and the creek sings against the stones, I think about everything that happened, the battles fought, the nights spent wondering if I had the strength to keep going. I think about Jennifer Miller now serving her time and watching the world move on without her. I think about Aspen Ridge, a little quieter these days, a little more respectful, but mostly I think about the trees, tall, ancient, patient trees. Their roots tangle deep into the earth, stubborn and unyielding, surviving storms and fires and human arrogance alike. I sit on my porch in the evenings, a cup of coffee in hand, and watch the sun set through the branches. The golden light pours through the canopy, casting long shadows across the fields. And I know, deep down, that everything worth saving is still here, still standing, still free.